Hello again, my old friend. Tonight, we begin our journey with the quiet rhythm of a man and his soil, far from the roar of cities and the clamour of warring factions. Let us step together into a forgotten patch of the Commonwealth, where wind sings low through broken fences, and one man has traded the noise of the world for the hush of planted rows. So dim the lights, listen close, and follow the glow of your pit boy down this long dirt path. It leads to a farmhouse at the edge of nowhere, and within its wooden bones a story is waiting to be unearthed. The fields had been good that year. Emery Holt ran a cracked thumb along the ridged spine of a mutfruit vine, nodding with silent approval as he examined the budding fruit. A lazy sun hung low in the afternoon sky, filtering its amber light across the earth with the same exhausted patience Emery applied to most things these days. It had been 3 weeks since he last saw a traveller pass by the old road, and longer still since anyone dared step past his fence without permission. That suited him just fine. He hadn't spent the better part of a decade fortifying this land, just to watch it be trampled by some half-starved raider looking to score potatoes. His knees ached as he straightened, pressing a hand into the small of his back with a groan. Not that the pain mattered. It was just another whisper from the body, reminding him of days lost and battles outgrown. The leather strap of his pack creaked as he swung it over one shoulder, loaded with a few salvage tools and a chunk of Brahmin cheese wrapped in a faded cloth. A quiet lunch beneath the windmill was tradition, though the old thing barely spun these days. Still, it stood tall above the barn, its metal arms stretched against the sky like some rusted sentinel watching over his little kingdom of dirt and ghosts. The house was just visible past the tree line, a 2-story relic of pre-war craftsmanship, now covered in layers of patchwork siding and hand-repaired windows. It wasn't pretty, but it held together. Emery had fixed every inch of it with his own hands, rebuilt the porch twice, and even found an old bathtub deep in a salvage yard north of Bedford Station. It was cracked and rust-stained, but it held water and reminded him sometimes of gentler days. He passed the fence line where an old bell dangled, tied to a bent post. He hadn't rung it in years. It was once meant to summon his daughter back from the fields when dinner was ready, but that was before. Now it just swayed in the wind like a forgotten prayer. Inside the house, the air was cool and still. The shutters were drawn to keep the heat out, but sunlight bled in through the gaps, casting thin lines across the wooden floorboards. Emery set the pack down on the table, took a seat, and exhaled long and slow. He poured a cup of weak tea from a ceramic pot and sipped it while watching dust motes dance in the light. There was a comfort in this silence, in knowing every creak and groan of the house as if it breathed alongside him. Then a sound, distant, sharp, gunfire, 3 pops fast and close together, followed by silence so sudden it made the air feel too thin. Emery didn't move at first. His eyes narrowed and he tilted his head, listening. Nothing, just the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. He set the cup down, stood slowly, and crossed to the window without making a sound. His boots didn't creak. He knew the boards that would. He parted the curtain with 2 fingers and scanned the tree line. Nothing yet. But gunfire in this part of the Commonwealth wasn't just random noise. It was a sign of something coming. He reached for the revolver hanging beside the door. An old .44, lovingly cleaned and rarely fired. It felt heavier than usual in his hand, not with weight, but with memory. Outside, the shadows had begun to stretch long across the yard. The wind shifted slightly, bringing with it the faint smell of burned rubber and hot metal. Emery's jaw clenched. He'd smelled that before, long ago, on battlefields that didn't have names, only numbers. Still, he didn't panic. He moved to the back of the house, unlocked a narrow trapdoor beside the pantry, and checked that the old cellar was ready. Shelves of canned goods, a backup water purifier, enough ammo to defend himself, though he hoped not to. He closed the trap gently and locked it behind him. Then he waited. An hour passed, maybe more. He didn't track it by time, only by the fading of light and the settling of the birds. It wasn't until he heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path that he knew his peace was ending. 4 figures, rough silhouettes against the dying light. One limped heavily, supported by the others. The tallest among them carried a rifle slung across one shoulder and a sharp, scanning gaze that marked her as the leader. Emery remained still, breath held behind a curtain of dust. They weren't here to barter, and from the way the wounded one was bleeding, they wouldn't be here long. not unless they had a reason to stay. His revolver rested in his lap. His hands did not shake. The bandits approached the front door, and Emery Holt knew, as the first fist pounded against the wood, that the soil he had tilled so carefully was about to drink blood once more. The knock was not a polite one. It landed with the weight of command, the kind of blow that demanded attention more than it requested entry. Another followed, then a third, less a knock and more a thud of something solid against the wood. Emery stood slowly, revolver still in hand but down at his side, not yet raised. He knew the sound of people who expected to be feared, and there was no quicker way to escalate bloodshed than to answer with your weapon pointed forward. The door rattled as someone tested the knob. It didn't turn. The bolt was drawn, the frame reinforced years ago after a group of half-starved scavvers tried to break in during a storm. Emery walked to the door and placed his shoulder against the frame, speaking through the crack where the planks didn't quite meet flush. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice low but firm. There was a pause, then a woman's voice answered. Rough, commanding but not immediately hostile. "We don't want your damn crops, old man. Just need a place to rest. One of ours is hurt bad. You got a roof. We'll trade for the time." Emery's eyes narrowed. There was a desperation under the veneer of control. She wasn't asking. She was trying to sell a story before they forced their way in. He thought of lying, saying he had company. But anyone with half a brain would have scoped the place and seen the single Brahmin, the solitary smoke trail. There was no bluff to be made. He considered his options. He could try to fight, maybe take one or two before the rest turned the house to splinters, or he could open the door, give them just enough of what they wanted to stay calm, and look for a better moment. The bolt slid back with a reluctant scrape. Emery stepped away, leaving the revolver tucked behind his hip as he opened the door. The four of them entered in a rush, not even pretending to wait for invitation. The first through the door was a broad-shouldered man wearing half a catcher's vest and a bandolier of rusted shotgun shells. His eyes swept the room with practiced aggression. Behind him came the woman who had spoken. Tall, wiry, dark eyes that didn't blink enough. She was dressed in scavenged combat armor painted with old war paint that had faded into cracked streaks. A pistol hung low on her hip, and her left hand rested on the grip with casual certainty. Third came a younger woman, maybe 19, with a buzz cut and jittery movements. She carried a pipe rifle and kept looking behind her like the shadows might bite. Last was the wounded one, a lanky teenager with sunken eyes and a deep, gut-level wound bandaged in filthy gauze. He leaned heavily on the leader, groaning with each step. Emery stepped back, letting them pass, and closed the door behind them. The lock clicked again, more habit than hope. "You got a name?" the tall woman asked. "Nope," Emery replied, and turned to retrieve a clean rag from the kitchen drawer. She smirked, but didn't press. "He's bleeding bad. Need a table and clean water. You got either?" Emery didn't answer, but he gestured to the dining room where a sturdy oak table sat under a dusty light fixture. He crossed to the sink and poured from the ceramic water filter into a steel pot. The water was clean, clearer than most raider camps had seen in months. The wounded one was groaning louder now, and as the leader laid him out on the table, Emery caught a better look. The bandage was soaked through, the smell of rot already clinging to the edges. The boy was fevered, half-conscious, muttering to himself. "Shot?" Emery asked, passing the water. "Shrapnel," said the woman, who had taken up a position near the doorway, rifle still in hand. "Convoy went bad. Minutemen ran heavier than we figured. So that was it. They'd hit a supply train or a patrol." It explained the bleeding, the panic, and the eyes on the windows. Emery kept his thoughts to himself, but a slow burn settled in his chest. He'd been out of the game for years, but some loyalties lingered. "Got any stims?" the leader asked. "Used my last 2 on a sick Brahmin last winter," Emery replied. "But I've got boil root and some surgical thread. Might be able to keep him from dying." She gave a sharp nod. "Do it." He didn't argue. He retrieved the supplies from a battered footlocker in the hallway, what little was left of his emergency stash, and began to work. The table creaked under the boy's shifting weight as Emery peeled back the crusted bandage. The wound was deep and angry. Metal lodged near the hip bone. Infection was already setting in. He spoke calmly as he worked, not out of kindness but precision. "If he's lucky, he'll keep the leg, but he'll be out of his head for a day or two, fevered and mean. Don't put a gun in his hand." The woman didn't answer. She stood by the window, watching the tree line like something might emerge from the dusk. The jittery girl paced in tight loops, muttering under her breath, while the big man ransacked the kitchen with methodical disinterest. "Name's Brex," the leader said after a while. "The kid's Finn, the big one's Yarrow, the girl's Beck." Emery didn't respond. Brex turned, one brow raised. "You're not big on talking, huh?" "I farm," Emery said, threading the needle through gauze. "Dirt's more honest than people." Brex gave a short, sharp laugh and went back to her vigil. As the last of the light bled from the sky and the wounded boy slipped into uneasy unconsciousness, Emery glanced at the shadows growing in the corners of his home. Strangers now moved through the rooms he'd built with silence and grief. They brought with them blood, noise, and the kind of weight that didn't leave when the door shut behind them. And deep beneath the house, in the cool earth of the cellar, something else had begun to stir. The box they'd hidden there, the one wrapped in canvas and warning tape, was no longer silent. It hummed. Night settled with the slow inevitability of winter frost. The farmhouse dimmed to a single oil lamp burning low on the kitchen counter, casting soft amber light across the floor and washing long shadows across the worn cabinets. Outside, the wind began its usual murmurs through the cornstalks, whispering secrets it had learned from other ruined places. Inside, Emery moved like a ghost in his own home, careful not to startle the strangers who now inhabited it like squatters in an old chapel. Brex took the living room for herself. She sat in his father's old armchair with one leg slung over the side, pistol balanced on her knee, posture loose but never relaxed. Yarrow dozed near the fireplace with his head against the brick, snoring lightly, his shotgun still resting on his lap like a faithful dog. Beck, the jittery one, had gone upstairs, ostensibly to sleep, but Emery heard her pacing every few minutes, circling the bedroom like a restless dog in a too small cage. As for Finn, the wounded boy, he remained laid out on the dining table, skin pale and slick with sweat, shivering despite the blankets draped over him. Emery leaned against the counter, sipping a tin cup of blackroot tea, eyes fixed on the hallway door that led to the cellar. The old door was shut tight, but something beneath it stirred faintly at the edge of hearing. It was subtle, not a sound exactly, more a sense like the tingling on one's spine when lightning was near, or the way animals shifted before a tremor. The air had changed. Even the insects had gone quiet. He hadn't asked what was in the crate they carried, and they hadn't offered, but he had seen the way they treated it. Brex had barked orders to get it inside before anything else. Yarrow had carried it himself, teeth gritted, as though even touching it came with some invisible weight. The crate was squat and unmarked, reinforced with heavy clasps and wrapped in layers of synthetic sheeting stamped with Minutemen field tags. No ordinary loot, no idle treasure. It pulsed faintly now, like a second heart buried beneath the floor. Emery poured a little of his tea down the sink, rinsed the cup and dried it in practiced silence. Brex glanced over at him from the chair, her eyes narrowed in the half-light. "You always this quiet?" she asked. "I don't talk to people who hold me at gunpoint," he said plainly. She smirked, resting her head back against the chair. "Fair." There was a long pause, the kind that grows heavy if no one breaks it. She shifted slightly, her voice more measured the second time. "You used to be someone, didn't you?" Emery didn't answer. "You got that look. Seen too much, said too little. You're not some rad-choked farmer born in the dirt. You were a fighter once. Minutemen? Gunner?" Emery wiped his hands with the rag and folded it carefully before replying. "Fighting's for people who still believe something good comes of it." Brex's smile faded a fraction. She didn't press further. The quiet returned, broken only by the occasional cough from Finn or the creak of old wood shifting in the frame. Emery stepped toward the hallway, glancing once toward the basement door, then continued to the back window. He opened it a crack to let in cooler air. The breeze smelled of soil and distant ash. A sharp noise interrupted the stillness, a soft moan from the dining room. Emery moved quickly and found Finn shifting, eyes half-lidded, lips twitching with murmured fragments. His fever had broken slightly, but his skin was flushed and his hands clutched at the blanket like a drowning man might grab for driftwood. "They're in the trees," he whispered. Emery leaned closer. Beneath the ground, the hum won't stop. She said not to open it. She said not to listen. Emery's brow tightened. He touched the boy's forehead, hotter than before. Finn's eyes opened briefly, pupils blown wide, iris shimmering faintly in the lamplight like oil on water. He focused on Emery with terrifying clarity for just a moment. It's not ours. It was never meant to be touched. Then he slumped back, breathing shallow. Brex appeared behind him. She'd heard enough to darken her expression. He's delirious, she said flatly. That wasn't fever talk, Emery replied. What the hell did you bring into my home? Brex's eyes flicked toward the cellar. None of your concern. It is now. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Look, we hit a convoy, all right. Thought it was a supply run. Food, meds, weapons, standard haul. But this crate was different. Sealed, tagged. Finn got spooked when we opened it, said it felt wrong, like it was watching him. He hasn't shut up since. What's in it? She shook her head. No idea. Some kind of tech. Biometric locks, containment seals. Looked Brotherhood in design, but tagged for Minutemen delivery. They were moving it across back roads off-grid. That alone tells you something. Emery stared at her for a long moment, then turned away. He crossed to the cellar door and laid a hand on the frame. It vibrated faintly. Not loud, not obvious, but it was there, like standing beside an old generator. The sense of energy just beneath your feet. He remembered the pre-war bunkers he'd scavenged once, years ago. Places where they tested things not meant for daylight. This felt the same. You've made a mistake, he said quietly. This thing, whatever it is, should have stayed buried. Brex's voice was dry. Welcome to the wasteland. Mistakes are what we trade in. Emery turned back to her. Get it out of here. She shook her head. We can't move it, not now. Patrols are sweeping the ridge. We stay hidden until they pass. Then we're gone. Emery's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to demand they leave, to put them all out and face the consequences. But something in the way the crate vibrated, in the boy's whispered warnings, made him hesitate. The damage might already be done. Brex returned to the chair and watched him without speaking. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering dry songs through the rows of mutfruit and barley. Inside, the crate below hummed faintly, steadily, like a deep breath drawn slowly inward, waiting to exhale. Morning came slow and reluctant, bleeding pale light through the warped slats of the boarded windows. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, scorched cloth and copper, an olfactory reminder of the strangers still occupying Emery Holt's home. He had not slept. He never did well with guests, and certainly not the kind who arrived bleeding and armed. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with a knife in one hand, a strip of bark in the other, whittling notches into a piece of firewood that already bore years of such scars. It gave his fingers something to do while his mind kept vigil. In the dining room, Finn moaned again. His fever had worsened overnight. The boy's skin had taken on a pale, waxy tone, lips cracked and eyes sunken. Every few hours he would mutter unintelligibly, sometimes in a voice that barely sounded like his own. Emery had heard enough delirium in field tents during the war to know fever dreams when he saw them, but something in Finn's ravings unnerved him. He spoke of metal trees and rivers of light beneath the soil, of faces in the walls and names that could not be spoken without bleeding. Brex hovered near him, concern buried beneath irritation. She hadn't slept either. Her armor hung open at the collar, and a fresh bandage wrapped around her forearm where something had clawed her during the night. She claimed it was a bramble snag. Emery had his doubts. Yarrow, the big one, remained mostly quiet, content to patrol the property with the patience of a wolf on a long hunt. He had taken a shine to Emery's tool shed and spent an hour inventorying the farmer's rusted implements. The man was no fool. He knew his way around weapons, but there was something off about him now. His eyes wandered, his speech slowed. The more time he spent near the cellar, the less present he seemed. Then there was Beck. She had come down from the second floor around dawn with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't speak at first, only stared at the others as if unsure whether they were still real. When pressed, she muttered about a dream, something about the crate opening, something about vines growing through the walls, about being rooted, unable to move while something whispered in her ear with her own voice. Brex dismissed it. We're all tired, she said. Stress, nothing more. But Emery knew better. He had seen the signs before, years ago, in a research outpost west of the glowing sea. They'd unearthed something then too, something they weren't meant to find, and before it was over, men who had been brothers turned on one another, hearing things that weren't there, dreaming with their eyes open. Emery stood from the table and moved toward the front door. The light outside was thin, filtered through high haze and the ash-blown wind that always seemed to carry more than dust. He stepped onto the porch, careful not to draw attention, and scanned the fields. The crops swayed gently. The air buzzed with the normal drone of insects, but under it, faintly, something else hummed, a frequency just below hearing. He couldn't place it, but it settled in his bones like an old injury aching before a storm. He moved to the fence, checked the posts. Everything was as it had been, yet his gut twisted. He reached the far end of the corn row, where he'd buried the compost pile the day before, and paused. Something was wrong. The earth had been disturbed. Not dramatically, no overturned soil, no obvious signs of digging, but the texture was different. The dirt was damp, darker than it had been, and the scent, there was iron in the air, unmistakable and sharp. He dropped to one knee and brushed the surface with his hand. His fingers came away stained red. Blood. He followed the trail with narrowed eyes, noting the subtle drag marks in the soil. A body moved through the stalks. The trail curved toward the barn. He stood slowly and approached the structure, revolver already drawn before he even reached the door. The barn had not been opened since the guests arrived. There was no reason to. The Brahmin were long dead and the space had become more storage than shelter. But now the door was ajar. He nudged it open with the barrel of the revolver, letting the morning light spill into the gloom. Inside, it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Dust floated in the sunbeams, and the smell hit him immediately. Blood and rot, mixed with the acrid stench of fear. The body was there, half concealed beneath a broken feed sack. Beck. Her throat had been opened, not with a blade, but with something rough, clawed. Her expression was frozen in a mask of silent horror, eyes glassy and fixed on the rafters above. Her weapon was gone. Her boots were missing. Something had dragged her here, hidden her with just enough care to delay discovery. Emery backed out, jaw tight, stomach hardening to ice. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He returned to the house, stepping inside with the quiet deliberation of a man already deciding what must be done. Brex looked up from her place beside Finn. Something happened? Emery met her eyes. You need to come with me, now. She rose, hand on her weapon, sensing the shift in him. Yarrow followed in silence. They crossed the yard together, entered the barn, and stood over the girl's body. Brex didn't speak for a long moment. Then, softly, God damn it. She was dreaming strange things, Emery said. Now she's dead. Something's moving through your heads. Something from that crate. Yarrow didn't react. His eyes stared blankly at the corpse, lips moving silently as if praying. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Brex looked at Emery. We burn the body. Keep the kid watched. As soon as he can move, we're gone. No, Emery said. You're not waiting. You're leaving. Now. She squared her shoulders. Not without the boy. You stay. More people die. She hesitated, then shook her head. We'll watch each other. That's how it works. Emery watched her retreat, the rising wind tugging at her coat. Back inside, Finn began to scream. Finn's scream tore through the house like a blade through silence, sharp and full of something more than pain. It wasn't a boy's cry, not entirely. It had depth, weight, like an echo from a throat not built to carry such sound. Emery dropped the lid on the boiling kettle and moved fast through the hall, boots striking the floorboards in steady rhythm. By the time he reached the dining room, Brex was already there, pistol drawn but not raised. Her stance wasn't combative, it was defensive, like she half expected something to crawl out of the boy's chest. Finn thrashed on the table, limbs contorted and flailing with desperate, spasmodic energy. His skin had taken on a pallid green-grey hue, mottled with red veining that pulsed beneath the surface like roots searching for purchase. The bandages Emery had wrapped around his midsection had come loose, soaked through again with fresh blood. But it wasn't just blood. Something else seeped through the cloth, thick and oily, leaving black stains where it touched the wood. His eyes flew open, not wild, not scared, but fixed, glassy, impossibly wide, and glowing, just faintly. A dull gold ringed the iris and the pupils had dilated into bottomless pits. He opened his mouth as if to scream again, but no sound came, only the distant humming. It wasn't audible at first, more like the sensation of sound than sound itself. Emery felt it in his teeth, behind his eyes. a low thrum vibrating through the air, as if the walls were trying to speak through the wood grain. Breck stepped back, her breath shallow, weapon now fully drawn and levelled at the boy's chest. "Don't," Emery said quietly. She looked at him, face pale, lips set. "He's not right. That doesn't mean he's lost." Brex hesitated, then lowered the gun an inch, though her knuckles stayed white on the grip. Finn's body spasmed once more, and then he went still. Not limp, just still, like something had reached in and pulled out the noise. He blinked once, slowly, then focused on Emery with unsettling clarity. "It's hungry," he whispered. Emery stepped closer, cautious, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "What is?" Finn swallowed hard. His breath hitched. His voice came quieter this time and not entirely his own. "The thing below, the coil, it dreams, and when it dreams, it feeds." Brex glanced at Emery, alarm rising beneath her control. "You hearing this?" Emery nodded, jaw clenched. "I've heard worse, just not in voices still breathing." Finn continued, voice hollow. "It wasn't meant to be found. They buried it deep, said it was too much mind, too much memory. The Minutemen tried to seal it off, transport it to the edge of the world and forget it ever existed, but we opened it, and it knows us now." Then he fainted. For a long moment, no one moved. The humming faded with the boy's voice, but its echo lingered in the room like a scent that wouldn't dissipate. Emery turned away, wiping a hand across his face. He'd been through hell before, through sieges, betrayals, whole towns leveled in the night. But this was something different. This wasn't war, it was invasion. Quiet, subtle, unseen. Brex stared at the boy like he was already a corpse. "We're in deep." "You brought this here," Emery said, unable to keep the bitterness from his tone. "You could have dumped that crate in the river, burned it, sealed it in a vault, but you dragged it to my door." Her reply was cold and quick. "We didn't know." "You know now." She didn't argue. Instead, she turned and stalked from the room, disappearing into the hallway that led to the cellar. Emery followed, catching up with her just as she paused at the basement door. She looked back at him, and something in her eyes had shifted. Not fear. Brex didn't strike him as someone who feared easily, but she looked tired, like she'd realized too late that the fire she'd stolen burned more than flesh. She opened the door and descended, Emery on her heels. The cellar was cooler than the house above, lined with stone walls slick with old moisture. Wooden shelves cradled canning jars, broken tools, and the forgotten clutter of a life once shared. But at the center of the room sat the crate. It stood silent and square, wrapped in thick fabric bearing the fading emblem of the Minutemen, an old sword and scales in a field of cracked navy blue. Several metal clasps ran down its sides, all still locked. A biometric pad blinked softly on the front panel, inactive but waiting. The hum that had permeated the house earlier was faint now, like a heartbeat slowed by distance. Brex stepped forward and placed a hand on the box. She flinched, as if expecting a shock, but none came. "It wasn't like this when we found it," she murmured. "Just cold metal, dead weight. Now, it's like it knows we're here." Emery didn't touch it. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed. "Do you believe in curses?" She snorted. "No." "Then believe in science you don't understand. Either way, we need to contain this." She nodded slowly. "How?" "Reinforce the cellar door. Wrap it in lead if I can find enough. Keep the boy away from it. And if anyone starts hearing voices, seeing things—" He paused, meeting her gaze. "They go outside. No exceptions." Brex didn't argue. She took a breath and nodded again, more firmly this time. "All right." They returned upstairs to find Yarrow standing at the back door, staring out into the cornrows. He didn't turn as they approached. Emery called to him. "You see something?" Yarrow didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw Beck, just now, walking the fence line." Brex stiffened. "Beck's dead." "I know," Yarrow whispered, but she was smiling. The wind picked up outside, rustling the stalks, and deep beneath the floorboards the crate began to hum again. The past doesn't sleep in the wasteland. It merely waits for the right silence to rise again. Emery knew this truth better than most. He carried his history like a splinter in the soul, too deep to pull out, too painful to ignore. And now, as he stood watching Yarrow's rigid back framed by the doorway, the man's words echoing into a house already burdened with tension, Emery felt the weight of that history stir. Beck was dead. He'd seen her corpse, laid eyes on the torn throat and the blood soaking into the barn straw. Yet Yarrow claimed to see her walking, smiling, the same calm grin she'd worn earlier, just before Emery had caught her staring too long at the cellar door. "No one's out there," Emery said, his voice a firm thread of reason. "You saw a shadow. Trick of the wind." Yarrow didn't turn. She waved at me, called my name. Brex stepped beside Emery. Her expression was tight, lips drawn to a hard line. She placed a hand on Yarrow's shoulder. "You need rest. You haven't slept since the ridge." Yarrow flinched at her touch like it burned him, stepping forward and away. "We should have left it," he muttered. "The crate. We should have left it in the sand." He walked into the field without waiting for permission. Emery watched the man vanish into the stalks, his broad shoulders slipping between rows like a phantom. Brex started after him, but Emery caught her arm. "Let him go," he said. "If he's gone too far already, there's nothing waiting inside this house that'll bring him back." Brex looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She just stared after Yarrow and then shut the door quietly behind her. They moved back to the dining room. Finn was quiet again, his breathing slow but steady. Emery crouched beside him, checking his pulse, noting the strange heat that still radiated from the boy's skin. Something unnatural clung to him now, like residue from a dream that hadn't fully faded. Emery's mind kept circling back to the things Finn had said, to the glow in his eyes, the humming in the walls, and that final whisper. It dreams, and when it dreams, it feeds. It reminded him too much of her. Years ago, before the land had turned dry and hard, before he buried his name and his rank beneath the calluses of farm work, Emery had served with the Minutemen, not in the ragged, desperate ranks they'd become in recent decades, but in the old days, when order meant something, when settlements built walls not just of scrap, but of trust. He was a sharpshooter then, clean hands, precise focus, a man who believed in the cause, and she had believed in science. Emery Holt, scribe first class, brotherhood defector, and the woman who'd made Emery believe there was more to life than enemies in a scope. She'd walked away from the brotherhood not for politics, but for principle. Their vaults of forgotten technology held too many things that didn't belong to any one group. She'd told him once, over campfire and coffee, that some secrets couldn't be owned, only endured. Her last assignment had been to oversee the lockdown of a biotech installation west of Lexington, some buried lab marked in Brotherhood files with only a single phrase, "Coil 9, do not disturb." The mission had gone badly. Of the team that went in, only 2 emerged. Amara was not one of them. Emery had received her final message days later on a salvaged holotape, her voice distorted but clear enough to haunt him still. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it back. But that's all right. I need you to stay away from the coil sites. All of them. They're not what we thought. They're not storage. They're roots. Roots of something older. Something that remembers being awake and it's dreaming again." He had never told anyone. He'd left the Minutemen the next day, bought land with what he had, built the fences, and let the world forget him. But the world didn't forget. It just waits for men like Emery to grow quiet before it starts speaking again. Brex sat across the room now, cleaning her pistol with careful, slow motions. She wasn't watching him, but her shoulders were tight, like she knew something was coming. Outside, the wind had stilled. Even the usual rustling in the cornrows had fallen silent. "You need to get out of here," Emery said quietly. She looked up. "We're not leaving the boy. You might not get another choice." "You think it's that bad?" He nodded. "I've seen it before, or something like it." She narrowed her eyes. "You know what that thing is. I know what it's like when something buried starts to stir, and I know what happens to the people around it." She didn't reply, but she didn't argue either. She just returned to cleaning her weapon. As night fell again, Emery took a lamp down to the cellar. The crate was still there, unchanged in shape, but not in presence. Its hum had deepened, a low resonance like wind through an organ pipe. He could feel it in his bones now. The lead shielding Brex had used to wrap the lower corners was beginning to vibrate. Not enough to shake free, not yet, but enough to sing. He placed the lamp on the ground, sat cross-legged on the cold stone, and stared at the thing for a long time. "You took her from me," he whispered. The crate said nothing, but the hum rose slightly in pitch as though amused. Emery reached into his coat and pulled out an old dog tag. It wasn't his, it was hers. "If this is what you are," he said softly, "then you'll bury me too, but not tonight." He left the cellar with a plan already forming. If the thing below couldn't be removed, it would have to be sealed, and if it couldn't be sealed, it would have to be destroyed. The next morning came with no sunrise, just a sullen grey hanging over the homestead, the kind of sky that promised rain but never delivered, and left everything in a state of damp unease. The fog that had rolled in from the east clung to the ground like a second skin. Emery stood at the edge of his field, shovel in hand, staring at the rows of mutfruit that had begun to wilt, not from drought or rot, not from insects or soil exhaustion, but something deeper, something unseen. The plants bowed toward the center of the property, leaves curled inward, as if the earth beneath them had begun whispering things they couldn't bear to hear. He dug regardless, not for crops, not for harvest, but for metal. Near the edge of the north field, beneath an old false floor in his shed, Emery had once buried a cache of scavenged materials too dangerous to keep within reach and too valuable to discard. Lead ingots, bent plating, fragments of armored vestments stripped from dead Brotherhood patrols. He unearthed them now with methodical care, teeth clenched against the ache in his knees, breath clouding in the chill air. Each hunk of lead was heavier than he remembered. It felt symbolic, dragging the dead weight of old wars back into the world, but symbolism had no place in survival. He loaded what he could into a wheelbarrow and hauled it toward the house, sweat forming beneath his collar despite the cold. The ground seemed to resist his steps, as if reluctant to support the weight of his intention. Back at the house, Brex met him at the porch, rifle slung across her back. Her eyes flicked down at the lead with unspoken questions, but she didn't ask. Instead, she moved aside and let him pass, watching him like a cat watches a half-dead mouse, wary, curious, uncertain if the thing before her was still dangerous. "You planning to line the walls?" she asked finally. "The cellar, at least," Emery replied, maneuvering the barrow toward the steps. "Enough shielding might slow it down, keep whatever it's doing from spreading." Spreading. He paused at the door and looked at her fully. "You've seen the boy, the way the air feels, the crops dying. This isn't just radiation or psychic bleed. It's influence, contagion of thought. Every minute that thing stays active, it pulls more into its dream." Brex folded her arms. "You talk like it's alive. I don't think it knows the difference." She didn't respond, just helped him unload. Finn had not woken again. He lay quiet in the parlour, body fevered but limp, face still and slack as a corpse but for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His skin was pallid now, his lips darkened. The veins along his neck stood out, pulsing slow and deliberate, like vines creeping up the side of a crumbling wall. Brex hovered near him when she wasn't pacing, one hand always on her weapon, the other resting on the boy's shoulder with a kind of reluctant protectiveness. Yarrow had not returned. His absence hung over the house like smoke. Brex didn't speak of him, and Emery didn't ask. They both knew. Either the man had vanished into the mist like the ghosts that whispered to him, or he was out there still, watching from the edge of the world, half swallowed by the thing they'd unearthed. In either case, he would not return unchanged. By nightfall, Emery had reinforced the cellar door with 3 layers of salvaged lead plating, hammered flat and bolted over the existing frame. The hinges groaned under the added weight, but the structure held. He lined the interior stone wall with plates as well, placing them like tiles across the surface, sealing corners with melted solder and adhesive putty. The air grew thicker with each addition, not from fumes or heat, but pressure like the house was holding its breath. As he worked, the crate pulsed. It no longer hummed in a consistent pitch. Now it throbbed, a low, irregular rhythm like a heartbeat out of sync. Every few minutes it flared brighter beneath its canvas shroud, casting strange shadows against the lead-lined walls. Emery didn't look directly at it. He had learned long ago not to stare into things that stared back. Instead, he muttered old prayers, not to gods, but to people, to Amara, to his daughter. Names he hadn't spoken aloud in years passed from his lips like ritual, grounding him as he worked. He didn't believe in salvation, but he did believe in memory, and memory, he'd learned, could be armor if you shaped it right. Later, while washing his hands at the pump out back, he noticed something new. The roots of his mutfruit trees had begun to push through the topsoil. Not all of them, just a few, but enough to notice. They curled upward, as if trying to escape the earth itself. One root had split entirely, spilling black sap onto the ground. He knelt, touched the liquid, and recoiled at the cold. It was not sap. It was colder than the air, sticky and slow, and it clung to his skin with the persistence of oil. He wiped it off with burlap and went inside without a word. That night, as wind howled through the shingles and the fog pressed against the glass like breath on a mirror, Emery woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. Not Brex's, not his own. They were soft, measured, bare feet padding along the wooden floor. He rose without lighting a lamp, moving through the dark with the surety of a man who had built every inch of his home. He reached the hallway and saw a figure standing by the front door. It was Finn, awake. He faced the door, eyes closed, body swaying slightly like he was caught in a dream. His hands were outstretched, fingers twitching as if playing some invisible instrument. Emery stepped forward. "Finn." The boy didn't move. "Finn," he repeated, firmer. The boy's head tilted slowly to one side, and then he spoke, not with his voice, but with Amara's. "You always knew it would end like this." Emery froze. The boy turned and smiled. The smile did not belong on Finn's face. It stretched too wide, too knowing, carved across fevered skin like a mask worn by something pretending at humanity. Emery felt the weight of it before he registered the words. The cadence of Amara's voice, unmistakable, intimate, impossibly real. It struck like a hammer to the chest, rattling loose grief he had buried beneath a decade of silence and soil. He didn't move, didn't speak. His hand hovered just above the revolver at his hip, not quite touching it. To draw would be to escalate, but to do nothing would be to admit belief, to give shape to fear. Finn blinked slowly and tilted his head with a curious softness. The glow in his eyes had faded, but something lingered behind them, a shadow not cast by light. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, then lowered his hands to his sides and stepped back from the door. "She said you wouldn't listen," he whispered. Emery's voice came low and steady. "Who?" The boy's lip twitched. "The coil, it remembers you." A chill crawled across the back of Emery's neck. He took a slow step forward, hands open. "You're not making sense." Finn shook his head, eyes glassy. "It didn't want to be moved. That's why it screamed. We opened it, and it showed us things. Not all at once. Just enough to keep us watching. Brex thought it was tech, just more salvage. Yarrow saw something different. A vault. A promise." Emery reached out, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Finn didn't resist. His skin was cold to the touch, but no longer fevered. "What did you see?" Finn looked up at him, and for the briefest moment his gaze cleared. A scared kid. Lost. Then he whispered, "Myself, but not here, not now. Older, full of wires, smiling while I burned." Emery's grip tightened. Brex appeared behind them, rifle lowered, her face drawn in the dim glow of the hallway. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at the boy and nodded once. "We need to talk. Now." They gathered in the parlor, a triangle of shadows lit by the last of Emery's oil lamps. The crate remained below, untouched for now, but looming in the silence between their words. Finn curled into a blanket on the couch, eyes half-lidded but alert. He listened without speaking, as if absorbing every syllable with unnatural precision. Brex leaned forward, both elbows braced on her knees. "It wasn't supposed to be in that convoy," she said. "We hit a Minutemen patrol south of Prospect Hill. Scouting party, small time. But they were running with heavier protection than we expected. Turrets, escorts, and this one crate. Unmarked, sealed with biometric locks, off-books routing codes. No logs, just a destination. Coil 9. Emery stiffened. "You didn't think to leave it?" "We tried, at first. But then Yarrow touched it. Said he could feel it thinking. Said it showed him where it came from. We thought he was cracked. Then Beck started hearing the same things. She said it called to her while she slept. And you brought it here." Brex's jaw flexed. "We didn't have a choice. The kid was bleeding out. Patrols were chasing us north. We needed a place to hold up, and your farm was the first solid ground with walls." Emery shook his head. "You should have buried it." "You think I don't know that now?" They fell into silence. Outside, the wind rose again, keening through the trees with voices just out of reach. Finn stared at the window as though listening to them. Finally, Emery stood. "It's not tech, not like anything I've seen. It's part of something older, pre-war, maybe even pre-Brotherhood. I've seen records. Coil sites weren't storage depots. They were containment." Brex narrowed her eyes. "Of what? Sentience." She laughed once, short and sharp. "You mean a brain?" "I mean a thought that didn't die." Brex's expression darkened. Emery moved to the wall and pulled open an old drawer. From it, he retrieved a thin sheaf of papers, handwritten notes copied from his time with Amara, fragments of her work, scribbled diagrams and warnings he had never thrown away. He placed them on the table. She found mention of a project buried under Lexington, he said. Something the old world scientists called neural cultivation. They weren't just storing memories, they were growing minds. Minds made of data, laced into biological matter, self-learning, self-dreaming. One of them was called the coil, and when they couldn't control it, they sealed it, deep. Brex looked down at the notes, her lips moving silently as she skimmed. She said it might have survived, Emery continued. Not physically, but mentally, dreaming in the dark, waiting for someone to crack the vault. Brex exhaled slowly. And we were the ones stupid enough to find the key. Emery nodded once. Finn spoke again, voice distant. It's not angry, just curious. But it's dreams. They're too big for people. That's why it breaks them. Brex looked at him, then back at Emery. What happens now? Emery stepped away from the table. His eyes were hard. Now we stop it from waking further, before it decides it wants more than dreams. Downstairs the cellar groaned just once. A long, low creak of metal under strain. The crate was changing. The house was no longer quiet. It held its breath between every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind. But beneath the silence there was movement, subtle and constant. Emery could feel it in the bones of the structure, like termites chewing through timber, like the slow shifting of foundations before collapse. The crate below had stopped humming in that predictable rhythm. Now it pulsed at odd intervals, like it was learning to mimic something living. Emery stood in the back shed that evening, sorting through what little remained of his explosive stockpile. It wasn't much. 3 strips of demolition charge scavenged from an old rail tunnel years ago, a pair of frag grenades sealed in wax to prevent moisture decay, and half a canister of pre-war thermite paste he'd been saving to melt down stubborn equipment. All of it, he figured, would have to be used now. He placed the charges in a reinforced crate and secured them with foam packing, then tucked the detonator into his coat pocket. As he sealed the shed and stepped out into the dusk, he found Brex waiting near the steps to the porch, arms folded tight across her chest, gaze tracking the shifting mists that rolled across the yard. "You're building a kill switch," she said without accusation. He nodded. "If that thing breaches containment, I'm taking the whole cellar with it. I built this place with blast layers between the floors. It'll hold, just once." Brex glanced toward the barn, then back at him. "You planning to die with it?" "If I have to." "You don't have to. We could still run." Emery shook his head. "You saw what it did to Finn, to Beck. Yarrow vanished without a sound. If this thing follows us, it doesn't just kill people. It rewrites them, turns them into carriers." Brex's mouth tightened. "You think it's viral?" "No, worse, I think it's conceptual." That gave her pause. She didn't ask for clarification, just turned and walked beside him toward the house. Inside, Finn was awake again, sitting upright on the couch with a blanket over his shoulders. His eyes were sunken, but no longer glowing. The fever had faded like a fire doused with cold earth. He watched them enter, head tilted slightly the way birds regard strangers to their territory. "I know what it wants now," he said softly. Emery set down the crate of charges and crouched beside the boy. Finn's voice was steadier, almost calm. "It doesn't want to escape. It wants to spread. It feeds on thought, on belief. The more people know about it, the more it grows. That's why the Minutemen hid it, why the Brotherhood marked the site as sealed." Brex knelt on the other side of the couch. "Then how do we kill something made of thought?" "You forget it," Finn said. "Starve it, isolate it. But if you talk about it, if you even think about it too much, it latches on. You start seeing yourself differently, like it's showing you who you could be, or who it wants you to be." Emery stood slowly, exhaling through his nose. "Then the only way to stop it is to bury it, deep enough that no one can dig it out again, and make sure anyone who saw it doesn't live long enough to spread the story." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with threat. It was full of understanding. Brex looked up at him and nodded. "I'll help you finish the seal," she said. They worked late into the night, lining the cellar door with more scrap plating, sealing the seams with molten resin and resin-laced putty. Brex stayed close, handing Emery tools, tightening bolts, watching his movements with focused precision. Neither of them spoke as they rigged the demolition charges along the cellar foundation, just enough force to collapse the room into itself. If triggered, it would bring down the floor above and entomb the crate in 30 tons of rock, ash, and reinforced plating. When it was done, Emery set the final connection and tucked the small detonator into a box under his bed. It had a timer option, but he didn't program it yet, not unless there was no other choice. He found Brex in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a bottle of old bourbon and 2 glasses. She poured both and pushed one across to him as he sat. "I keep thinking about how we started," she said after a while. "We weren't supposed to survive the convoy raid. We knew it. It was a suicide job, just for enough caps to buy another month's medicine for Finn. Yarrow had family east, Beck. She just wanted to see the ocean once. None of us were heroes. We were just desperate." Emery took a sip. "Desperation makes dangerous people." Brex nodded. "And sometimes it makes fools." They sat in silence for a time. Outside, the fog deepened into black. Something distant howled. Not an animal, not wind. Something in between. Then Finn screamed again. Emery was up before his chair scraped the floor. They found him in the hallway on his knees, hands clutching his head. Blood leaked from his ears. His mouth worked soundlessly, teeth gnashing like he was biting back something unspeakable. When Brex reached for him, he flailed, screaming words they didn't understand, syllables that sounded like feedback, like broken radio transmissions forced through vocal cords. And then, just as suddenly, he stopped, collapsed forward, limp. Emery turned him gently and laid him flat. His pulse was there, barely. Eyes rolled back, lips twitching in a silent chant. "He's almost gone," Emery said. Brex knelt beside him, one hand on his chest. "We can't wait much longer." Emery looked at her, then down the hall to where the cellar door loomed like a closed wound. "No," he said, "we can't." The crate was ready. So were they. The last light was extinguished by Emery's hand just before midnight. No lamps, no candles, only the wind-blurred moon hanging over the field. Its silver light filtered through fog so dense it looked like the breath of something sleeping just beneath the land. Inside the house, silence reigned, unnatural, oppressive, a silence not of peace but of stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Emery stood at the top of the cellar stairs, rifle strapped across his back, detonator secured in the pocket of his coat. Brex was behind him, pistol holstered but unsnapped, her right hand never straying far from the grip. Neither had spoken since they lifted Finn's body from the hallway and settled him in the far bedroom. He hadn't stirred, hadn't whispered another word in that strange cadence, but the way he stared at the ceiling, unblinking, mouth half open, made Emery wonder how much of the boy was still left inside. They descended together, one careful step at a time, boots creaking on the old wood. The air grew colder with each pace downward, thick with the scent of rust and stone, and something else, ozone, rot, and static electricity, as if a storm had passed through and left its memory behind. When they reached the bottom, the glow was already visible. The crate no longer throbbed like a machine. It pulsed like a heart, slow and deliberate. Faint tendrils of light seeped through the cracks in the plating, soft, golden strands like candle smoke swirling in the still air. Around the base, the lead sheets Emery had spent days securing had begun to warp, edges curling outward as though repelled by the thing within. Brex stepped forward, squinting against the glow. "It's waking." "No," Emery said softly. "It's listening." The room vibrated, not through the floor or walls, but through their chests. A deep pressure settled into Emery's lungs, and his vision blurred for a moment, not from exhaustion or light fatigue, but because something had shifted behind his eyes, like a thought he hadn't thought yet was trying to make room. He shook it off and approached the crate, crouching beside the exposed biometric pad. It blinked in erratic pulses now, like it was responding to an unseen rhythm. The casing's surface was no longer smooth. Strange symbols had formed along the edges, raised ridges in patterns that made no logical sense, as if language had bent itself to emotion. Brex touched his arm. "Are we sure this is the only way?" Emery met her eyes. "I think it's the only way left." She nodded and drew her pistol, checking the load with automatic efficiency. He knelt and placed one hand on the biometric pad. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world shifted, not visually, not with light or sound, but within. Emery's knees buckled, and he pitched forward, caught only by Brex's quick hands. The crate flared brighter, casting long shadows against the cellar walls. He could feel something rooting through his thoughts, memories flickering behind his eyelids like old film strips. The war, Amara's laugh, the feel of soil between his fingers the day he laid the first crop. All of it was open, laid bare, and then something spoke, not in words but in feeling, understanding, curiosity. Why do you resist? The thought was not his. It was a presence, vast and impossibly old, pressing its consciousness into his mind like water flooding a valley. It didn't force, it asked, and that made it worse. He gasped and pulled his hand away. Brex caught him as he staggered. What did it say? He steadied himself against the wall. It doesn't want to destroy. It wants to become. She frowned. Become what? Emery wiped sweat from his brow. Us. Brex turned toward the crate, her features hardening. Then we don't give it the chance. She reached into her coat and retrieved the small canister of thermite paste. Emery moved with her, securing the charges they'd rigged earlier, placing them with precision around the crate's base. They worked in sync, wordless, like two veterans rebuilding a barricade during a siege they knew would not end in rescue. The glow intensified with each minute. The crate began to hum again, but now it had cadence, like breath, like speech. As they finished the final placement, a sound drifted through the cellar, soft and crystalline. Laughter, not mocking, not cruel, familiar. Amara. Emery froze, heart hammering. The voice echoed from the walls, not from the crate, as if the stones themselves remembered her. Brex looked around, eyes wide. That's not possible. She told me this might happen, Emery said barely above a whisper. She warned me the coil could mimic, that it learns from us, shows us what we most want to see. The laughter faded, replaced by silence. The glow dimmed slightly as if disappointed. Emery pulled the detonator from his pocket and armed the trigger. We finish this now, before it convinces us not to. They stepped back to the base of the stairs. Brex took one last look at the crate. You sure you wired it right? If I didn't, we'll never know. He held the detonator in his hand, thumb over the switch. His breath slowed. He thought again of Amara, of her voice in the tape, the warnings she left like breadcrumbs through time. This was what she'd feared. Not death, but continuation. Say it, he muttered. Brex glanced at him. Say what? The last line. From the tape. Brex frowned, but then her eyes widened as she remembered. He'd let her read the transcript once, years ago, when they'd both been drunk and full of stories. She nodded. If it wakes, she whispered, don't fight it. Forget it. Emery pressed the button. The blast didn't roar. It didn't scream through the bones of the house like some hungry thing. It exhaled, a breathless collapse of sound and pressure that folded inward, tight and merciless, as if the very air had been pulled down into the earth. The cellar imploded with a low, concussive thud, not explosive but inevitable, like a monument sinking into the sand. Dust shot up through the floorboards in thick clouds, smothering light and breath alike, and for several seconds Emery couldn't tell if he was alive or buried with the thing they'd sealed. When the shaking stopped, he lay sprawled at the base of the stairs, ears ringing, chest heaving. The detonator was still clutched in his hand. Beside him, Brex coughed and wiped dust from her eyes, her face streaked with soot and something like relief. They sat in the silence that followed, lungs aching. The cellar door now nothing but a slab of splintered boards and warped hinges. Where the stairs had once descended, there was only a gaping wound in the floor, a black crater ringed with broken stone and twisted lead. Heat still radiated from below, not fire but energy, residual, spent, but not entirely gone, like the heartbeat of something wounded, not killed. Emery didn't move right away. He stared into the void, waiting for something, anything, to crawl from it. A tendril of light, a whisper, a memory not his own. But the air remained still. Brex rose first, unsteady on her feet. She stepped cautiously toward the edge, peered down, then turned back to him with a look that said what neither of them could yet believe. It's quiet. He stood slowly, joints aching. For now. They sealed the breach with what they had left. Collapsed furniture, metal beams, every inch of lead they hadn't used. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't scientific, but it was heavy. And sometimes, Emery had learned, weight could be a kind of prayer. They worked until dawn, fingers bleeding, eyes stinging, muscles pulled taut from fear and exhaustion. By the time the sun had risen above the tree line, spilling weak light across the farmhouse, the crater was a sealed scar. Finn was awake when they returned to the house. He sat in the kitchen wrapped in a blanket, sipping water with slow, deliberate swallows. His eyes were no longer distant, no longer glowing, just tired, human. Brex knelt beside him, hand on his shoulder. "You in there?" He nodded, small and slow. "It's gone." "You sure?" He met her gaze with something steady. It stopped talking. Emery poured himself a mug of stale coffee and leaned against the counter. "You remember what it said?" Finn shook his head. "Not clearly. It's like trying to remember a dream you never had." Emery nodded, though the boy's answer did little to settle the tightness in his chest. He didn't trust things that left no trace, not in the wasteland. Brex turned toward him. "We need to move. If anyone heard that blast, they'll come looking. Regulators, Brotherhood, even Minutemen." Emery didn't respond immediately. He looked around his home, at the walls he'd built with his own hands, at the chair his wife had carved before the world had turned cruel. The wind outside rustled through the broken cornrows, whispering through the empty stalks like a lullaby for ghosts. Finally, he said, "You go, I'll stay." Brex frowned. "You'll be a target." "I already was. If they find the site, they'll need someone to lie, someone to say it was just a gas pocket or a weapon malfunction or raiders getting careless." She stood, arms folded. "And if someone digs again?" Emery met her gaze. "Then I'll be here to stop them." She looked like she wanted to argue, but after a moment she just nodded. No one in the wasteland got to keep what they loved, but they could choose where they made their last stand. An hour later, she left with Finn, heading west toward the coast. She promised to stay quiet, to burn any remaining maps, to erase the trail they had carved through the ash. Emery watched them disappear into the fog, then turned back to the house and shut the door. The days that followed passed in haze and dust. No travelers came, no patrols, only the wind and the creak of the house settling over its buried secret. Emery returned to his routines, tending to the surviving crops, mending fences, replacing windows shattered by the blast's pressure. But nothing felt the same. At night, he would sit by the fire, notebook in hand, and record what had happened, not for others, for himself, so he wouldn't forget, so that if one day his own mind began to slip, he'd have something to hold on to, proof that it had been real. But the more he wrote, the harder it became. Sentences unraveled, names blurred. Some nights he would wake with a start, certain he had heard Amara's voice again. Other times he would stare into the flame and wonder if any of it had happened at all, if perhaps he'd imagined it, dreamed it, invented it to give shape to some old guilt. And then he'd feel the weight in his coat pocket, the shattered remains of the detonator, and remember the sound of the cellar collapsing. It had been real. One evening, as twilight turned the fields to shadow, he stood at the edge of the buried crater and listened, just to be sure. No hum, no voice, only the sound of wind. He turned to go, the last light of the sun painting long shadows across the broken soil. But just as he reached the porch, he paused. A single sprout had broken through the dust near the crater's edge, green and vibrant, impossibly healthy in soil that had not supported life in months. He bent down, touched it. It was warm, not from sunlight, from within. Emery stood over the sprout for nearly an hour. The evening deepened around him, the sky streaked with the bruised tones of dusk, yet he did not move. The leaf's surface glistened with moisture that hadn't come from dew, and when his fingers brushed it again, he felt it, not heat exactly, but vitality, a thrum, a tremor in the stem that mimicked the beat of a heart. The plant was alive in a way that defied the parched soil around it, untouched by ash or drought, vibrant and alert as though it had not merely sprouted but arrived. He dug it up, slowly, carefully, with the precision of a surgeon. Emery loosened the surrounding dirt and lifted the root structure into view. There were no tendrils of seedling white, no branching filaments groping blindly for nutrients. Instead, a single thick root ran downward, glossy and black, vanishing into a crevice that hadn't been there before. It was as though the sprout hadn't grown from the soil at all, but had been inserted into it, like a pin into flesh. He cut it. The stem bled. Not sap, blood. Not red, but dark and iridescent, shimmering faintly in the fading light. It dripped slowly, a viscous rhythm that sent a shiver through Emery's spine. The wound closed almost immediately, skinning over with impossible speed, leaving behind a fine scar of translucent fibre. He tossed the plant onto a rusted tin sheet beside the well, then stepped back and sat hard on the porch steps, breath unsteady. The seal hadn't held, or worse, it had held but too late. The thing below, whatever it was, had left something behind. A seed, a root fragment, a whisper coiled into the memory of the earth. And now, like fungi clinging to a felled tree, it had begun to sprout again. Not with noise, not with light, but with biology. Emery did not sleep that night. He spent the dark hours watching the sprout from the porch, lantern dimmed low, rifle across his knees. No movement came from it, no further growth. But in the absolute quiet of the small hours, he thought he heard it breathing. A low intake, a slow exhale. He told himself it was wind across the tin, but the truth was heavier than that and far more patient. At dawn, he burned it. He didn't bury it, didn't compost it, didn't risk it taking root in another patch of ground. Instead, he soaked it in lamp oil, wrapped it in cloth, and set it alight at the far end of the field, near the ridge where the wind blew east and away. It screamed as it burned, not in sound, but in sensation. Emery could feel the resistance in the fire, a pull in the pit of his stomach, a wrongness that made his teeth ache, but he didn't look away. He watched until it was ash, and even then he waited. For 2 days, nothing grew. No more sprouts, no more strange symbols etched in bark or soil, no more dreams he didn't recognize. But the soil where he'd found the root remained dark and moist, too rich, too fertile, as though it had been conditioned for something more than crops. On the 3rd day, someone arrived. She came walking from the edge of the woods, a figure in a battered coat and scarf, shoulders squared, gait unhurried. A long rifle rode across her back, and a respirator mask hung from her belt. Emery spotted her from the barn roof, where he'd been checking for mold in the hayloft. He slid down the ladder and met her halfway across the yard, hand resting on his hip. She raised both palms. "Not looking for trouble. Few folks come here unless they already found it," Emery replied. She pulled back her hood. Short hair, streaked with grey, eyes sharp and tired. "Name's Skell. I work salvage out past Warwick. Word is something loud came from this way. Some folks thought it was a detonation. Others thought different." Emery didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly. "You alone out here?" He nodded. "Anyone come through recently?" He shook his head. "Just me, just the wind." She looked past him toward the house. "Looks quiet." "It is." A pause stretched between them. Skell studied him for a long moment. Then, "Mind if I sit?" Emery gestured toward the porch. They sat. She produced a small tin from her coat, tapped 2 hand-rolled cigarettes into her palm, offered one to him. He declined. She lit hers and stared across the field. "I've seen things," she said softly. "Places where the land twists wrong, where animals don't behave like animals, where people stop being people." Emery stayed quiet. "I was part of a recon team near the old coil stations," she continued. "East of here, back when the Brotherhood still gave a damn. One site turned out to be dormant, sealed tight, but the other, something inside, had bloomed. We lost 2 before we even breached the vault." He turned to her. "What was inside?" She took a slow drag, then exhaled. "A garden." Silence fell again. Finally, Emery asked, "Why are you really here?" She didn't answer right away, just flicked ash onto the porch floor and said, "Because sometimes, when something goes quiet, it means it's about to grow louder, and I wanted to see what kind of quiet this was." They sat there a while longer, until the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long. When she left, Emery didn't stop her, but that night he patrolled the edge of the crater again, just to be sure. And there, nestled in the crook of a half-buried stone, another sprout had emerged, thicker, taller, smiling. The second sprout was not alone. By morning there were 5. They dotted the rim of the buried crater like sentinels, each one slightly taller than the last, as though racing toward some unspoken purpose. Their stems were smooth and too straight, unnatural in posture, with no bend to follow the wind's flow. Emery circled them with the quiet resolve of a man counting ammunition before a siege, noting the distance between them, the symmetry of their placement. This was not chaos. It was a design. He burned them again, more thoroughly this time, dragging a steel barrel from the shed and building a pyre fueled with diesel and broken timber. He burned until there was nothing left but clumped ash and a smell that clung to his skin like rot soaked into cloth. The fire drew no attention. No scavengers, no insects, no birds. Even the sky above seemed reluctant to cast sunlight upon the act. Emery did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, the broken detonator before him, and listened. He wasn't sure what he was listening for. Not sound exactly, but presence, a change in the air, the faint echo of something intelligent trying to push through the veil between thought and form. That was how it had started before, with a hum, a whisper in the walls, a boy dreaming other people's thoughts. Now there was only quiet, but not the good kind, the kind that builds in a room before the glass breaks. By dawn, he checked the crater again. 7 sprouts. He didn't bother burning them this time. He stood there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the closest one. It was taller now, knee-high, with leaves beginning to unfurl like fingers testing the air. The others quivered slightly, though there was no wind. He turned and walked back to the shed. If the fire hadn't worked, if containment had failed, there was only one path left: memory. He dug into the old lockbox beneath the floorboards and retrieved the last of the tapes, Amara's research notes, copied and spliced from half-fried terminals and salvaged drives, pieced together like scripture by a man who no longer believed in salvation. He fed them into the portable reader and listened again. Her voice had changed over the entries. At first it was clinical, objective, composed, the voice of a scientist holding the world at arm's length. But later, her tone grew softer, the edges blurred with emotion. She had begun to understand that the coil wasn't a device, it wasn't even a weapon, it was an idea. "There is no language for this," she said in one of the last recordings. "Not in any databanks, not in philosophy. It doesn't think like we do. It doesn't want what we want. It doesn't want at all. It simply exists, and because it exists, it spreads. Not like a virus, like a pattern, like a truth too heavy for one mind to hold. So it spills into the nearest one, and the next, until the world begins to hum with its song." Emery rewound that part 3 times. A truth too heavy for one mind to hold. He shut off the player. The next morning, the sprouts had doubled. 14 now. 2 of them already flowered, small blossoms of iridescent blue that shimmered even in shadow. They leaned toward him as he approached, not as plants reaching for light, but like faces leaning in to listen. That was when the dreams began, not his own. He would drift into sleep for minutes at a time, only to awaken mid-breath, his heart hammering. Memories not his own pressed into the backs of his eyes like thumbprints. Scenes of places he had never been. Vaults buried under black rock, fields of metal trees humming in the dark, a sky with no stars and a sun that pulsed like a wounded eye. Always in the distance, something massive and unseen, watching, waiting. In one of the dreams, he saw a man with no mouth whispering through the roots of a dead tree. In another, he stood inside a house that wasn't his, speaking with a version of Amara that bled light from her eyes. She told him to run, but when he turned to flee, the door led back to the crater. He stopped sleeping after that. Brex had taught him how to dose with stim tabs years ago, back when they'd both been in rougher parts of the wastes. They kept him upright now, even as the dreams clawed at the edges of his waking hours. He paced the house like a ghost, rifle always within reach, eyes red from sleeplessness and smoke. The sprouts continued to grow. By the end of the week, the crater had become a garden. Not in the traditional sense, no soil enrichment, no irrigation, just growth, unchecked, unnatural, flowers that bled light, leaves that whispered without wind, roots that cracked the earth as if searching for something lost. One morning he found a single vine had crept through the kitchen window. He cut it, burned it, sealed the frame, but the next night he found one curled around the handle of his bedroom door, like a finger tapping to be let in. He sat on the porch after that, dozing in intervals, rifle across his knees. When Skell returned, she didn't come alone. 3 others walked with her, dust-covered, rifle-bearing types with the sunken stares of those who'd seen too much and made peace with the aftermath. She said nothing as they approached. Emery didn't rise. He just nodded once and gestured toward the field behind him. They saw it too, the unnatural curve of the stalks, the symmetrical rise of the flowers, the color that shimmered just wrong in the daylight. Skell crouched beside him. "How long?" Since the blast, Emery said. I thought it was sealed. You buried it. You didn't starve it. He didn't respond. She lit a cigarette. We're going to have to salt the earth. He turned to her. You brought charges. No, she said. We brought silence. And somewhere behind them the garden began to hum. They began at dawn, because that's when memory is weakest. Skell's team moved with quiet certainty, hauling canvas sacks of powdered lime, magnesium phosphates, and crude chemical agents better suited for corpse disposal than agriculture. They didn't speak much. Names were exchanged once, at the porch. Elric, Nora, Hesh, but Emery didn't retain them. These were people who came after the fall, after vaults and enclaves and fallen flags, not soldiers, not settlers, just erasers. The plan was not to burn. Fire only fed the roots. Fire made the soil receptive. What they brought was a sterility so complete that even ash would not cling. They started with the outer ring, laying the chemical mixture in precise arcs, digging narrow trenches to guide the runoff. Emery worked with Elric, a rail-thin man with eyes too old for his frame, both of them shoveling through soil that pulsed faintly underfoot. The ground resisted their efforts, not in mass but in feeling. It squirmed, not visibly, not audibly, but through the shovel's wooden handle, Emery could feel the friction of something thinking, something aware. By midday, 29 sprouts had been removed, not harvested, not pulled, removed. Emery took the word from Nora, a scarred woman who handled the excavation like a mortician, respectful, methodical, grim. She used a sharpened spade and carried the pieces in black cloth, wrapping each with a reverence Emery did not understand. When asked, she only said, "They know when they're not wanted, so we don't give them time to plead." One of the sprouts bloomed as she touched it, not with colour, with sound, a single note, high and trembling like glass about to crack. The team froze. Hesh levelled his weapon. Skell reached into her coat and pulled free a pocket EMP grenade, thumbing the trigger as she stepped toward the noise, but it stopped, just as quickly as it had begun. The bloom closed and the sprout wilted. "We're not just killing roots," Emery said later, as they layered soil laced with salt and powdered bone meal over the cleared ring. Skell nodded. "We're killing the memory of growth." That night, they camped in silence, not out of fear, but strategy. Speech had a way of shaping thought, and thought shaped reality. The garden wasn't fed by sunlight or water. It fed on narrative. The coil had always been a thought form, a pattern seeking hosts, and Emery knew now that even remembering it gave it shape. Amara's warnings weren't about destruction. They were about forgetting. Don't fight it. Forget it. But he couldn't forget. Not the sound. Not the roots. Not the voice of a dead woman calling his name through the mouth of a fevered boy. While the others slept, Emery walked the edge of the crater. The chemicals had worked, for now. The sprouts were gone. The soil was chalk white and reeked of alkaline burn. But beneath it, the hum had returned, faint, distant, but real. He stopped at the center where the cellar had been. The rubble still lay in place, layers of melted lead and splintered timber forming a hard shell over the buried thing. It should have been enough. By any sane measure, it was entombed. But this wasn't sanity they were fighting. In the center of the blast site, a single crack had appeared in the stone, no wider than a finger, but deep, too deep. It pulsed faintly, lightless like breath behind a sealed mouth. Emery knelt beside it. He didn't speak. He didn't think. He simply listened. Nothing came. Then a flicker of warmth, too subtle to name. A pressure in the chest. A memory that wasn't his. A field, endless and golden beneath a sky of glass. A voice humming an old lullaby, one he'd never heard before but recognized all the same. He rose and walked back to the house. Skell met him at the porch, arms folded, eyes sharp despite the darkness. "It's not done," she said. "No, we can salt it again. It won't matter." "Then what will?" Emery looked past her toward the tree line. The stars were hidden behind a high curtain of cloud, the moon a smear of silver across the fog. "You have to forget it," he said. "All of you." Skell frowned. "That's not how this works." "It has to be. If you remember, it remembers, and if it remembers, it grows." She was quiet a long time, then, "What about you?" "I'll stay. I'll keep it down. You're one man. I'm the last witness. If I go, there's no one left to remind the world. And if it breaks through, then let it come for me first." She stared at him for a long while. Then she nodded. The next morning, they left. Skell didn't argue. Nora didn't say goodbye. Hesh gave a single salute, not military but respectful. Elric handed Emery a vial of dust, synthbone and lime, and said, "Pour it when you hear the wind whisper your name." And then they were gone. Emery stood alone again, just a man on a poisoned patch of earth, tending to silence like a crop that could never be harvested. The hum did not grow louder, but it never went away. The seasons turned without permission. Summer bled into a rust-coloured fall, and Emery remained on the land, the last man to remember. The farmhouse aged with him. Its paint peeled. Its roof grew soft in places. The fences bowed beneath their own weight, no longer needed to guard crops that would never again be sown. But the house stood, and so did Emery. He lived alone now. No radio, no visitors, only the wind and the silence, and the faint echo beneath the earth that reminded him every morning why he still breathed. The crater had grown cold, the soil had hardened, and yet each night before sleep took him, Emery walked its edge with a lantern and a spade, ensuring nothing green had dared rise again. The sprouts had not returned, not in months, but he never stopped checking. He spoke aloud sometimes, though not often, just enough to remind himself of the sound of his voice. Sometimes he recited Amara's old field notes, committed to memory and repeated like scripture. Other times he simply spoke to her, an apology, a confession, a litany of what the land had become and what it would never be again. He kept the soil salted, not just around the blast site, but in concentric rings expanding outward. Every month he extended the radius. It was ritual more than science. The memory needed boundaries. The idea needed prison bars. In early winter, the snow came soft and thick, burying the field in white. Emery stood on the porch and watched it fall, arms wrapped in a patched coat, shotgun resting beside him. The silence was different in snow, heavy, honest. There were no secrets in snowfall, only the steady hush of a world exhaling. It was that silence he feared the most. One evening, as he carved dried meat by candlelight, he heard it again, the hum, faint as always, but somehow closer, not louder, more present, like it wasn't in the earth anymore, but in the walls. He stood and checked every corner of the house, lantern held high. No vines, no bloom, no whispering root at the base of the cellar that no longer existed, just wood and stone and air. But in the mirror his eyes glowed faintly. He stared for a long while, unmoving. The glow wasn't constant. It flickered, as though something behind the reflection were trying to make itself known. He didn't panic. He simply blew out the candle and turned the mirror to face the wall. The hum receded. The next morning he took the mirror to the crater and buried it beneath a slab of rusted steel. It didn't glow again. More weeks passed. The birds returned in spring briefly. He heard them one morning, sparrows nesting in the broken eaves, chirping like the world had healed. He let them stay, watching with a distant smile as they scavenged for seeds he hadn't scattered. Life, stubborn and blind. But that evening the song changed. One of the birds sat on the porch railing staring at him, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, not broken, aware, observing. Emery didn't move, didn't speak. After a full minute the bird opened its beak, and it hummed. Not birdsong, the hum. He raised the shotgun slowly, heart breaking, and fired. Feathers scattered, no corpse remained, just an absence. That night he sat by the crater again, rifle beside him, flask of Amontillado at his side. He stared at the salted soil, now pockmarked with snowmelt, and listened for something more than sound, and he understood. It wasn't the coil that had survived, not fully. The crate, the consciousness, those had been buried, suppressed, but the idea of it, the memory, lived on, in him. In every moment he recalled the voice, the dream, the feeling of something older and larger pressing against the edges of understanding. He was its vector now, the last witness. It didn't need sprouts or vines, it needed attention. It fed not on blood or biomass, but on thought, on belief, on the soft gravity of memory. He had kept it alive, and if he died with it, it would die too. So he stopped writing. He burned the last pages of Amara's notes, the transcribed tapes, the diagrams and scrawled warnings, the detonator pieces, the map, everything that connected this land to something greater. He did it without drama, without sorrow. He stood in the smoke and let it coat his lungs. He ate less, slept more, let the routine slip, let the land forget him. And slowly, so slowly he could not mark the moment it began, the hum faded, not into silence, into absence. That spring, he took one final walk around the crater. No sprouts, no warmth, just earth, dead and indifferent. He nodded once, a movement more tired than triumphant, and returned to the house. He sat in the rocking chair by the porch, stared into the sunrise and let his thoughts drift into places without edges. The hum didn't follow. The dreams stopped. Even the birds returned, ignorant and loud. He was no longer a farmer, no longer a prisoner. He was the last man to carry a memory too heavy for the world to hold, and with each breath he let it go.